Hi and welcome to True Crime with Kesh. This is my very first video and I have decided to start this channel because of my keen interest in true crime. Also, I would like to share with you some of the cases that have fascinated and intrigued me over the years. In today's video, I will be discussing Stewart Wilken, aka Boetie Boer, a South African serial killer who has known to commit 10 murders in Port Elizabeth during 1990 until 1997. Before I start, I would like to let you know in this video I will be discussing some graphic elements of murder, including child abuse. So I wanted to give a heads up to those of you that are sensitive to this type of information. We start things off in Boksburg on the 11th of November 1966. This is when Stewart Wilken was born. At just 6 months old, he and his 2-year-old sister were abandoned by their parents at a telephone booth. A domestic worker who was walking by at the time saw these two children and decided to take them back to her employer, who was known as Doop. Things were not about to get any better for Stewart Wilken. After being abandoned, Doop decided to take on the children to keep them, but he was an evil man and he committed horrific acts of torture and child abuse, such as burning Stewart's genitals with cigarettes, tying Stewart up with his dogs, and forcing him to eat food from dog bowls. Doop would also perform acts of bestiality with his animals, and once he was completed, he would force little Stewart to lick his genitalia to clean it. As you can imagine, for such a young child, this is an awful experience to go through. And this occurred for around 1.5 years. During this time, Stewart's sister disappeared. He would never see her again, and he would often wonder where she went to. A seeming silver lining in this is that Stewart had neighbors, and they were called the Wilkens family. The Wilkens family had a lot of compassion for Stewart because they would see this little boy malnourished, infested with lice, just a really severely neglected young child. And they made the decision to take him in and start the process of formal adoption. In order to adopt Stewart, they needed the consent of one of his birth parents. Stewart recalls a time where a woman came over to the Wilkens family home and offered him a packet of sweets. He rejected these sweets. Years later, he would come to find out that this was his biological mother signing over her parental rights to Stewart to the Wilkens family. The Wilkens family decided to name the boy who went by Boetie Boer as Stewart Wilken. And as such, nobody knows what Stewart's real birth name is. The Wilkens decided to move to Port Elizabeth with Stewart, and here they enrolled him in primary school. In school, Stewart did not fare well, either academically or socially. He failed grade 1, and Mrs. Wilken, his adoptive mother, assumed that he just did not try hard enough and decided to withhold one of his Christmas presents for the year as punishment. This really angered Stewart, and he made a vow that he would not try hard at school ever again. He went on to fail grade 3 3 times, and because of this, the school decided to put him in a special needs class as they thought he had a learning disability. Things in this class were not good for Stewart. He claims that the teacher incited the students to mock him for being adopted. He claims that he was not even aware that he was adopted until such time as the students would mock and bully him for this. He became so frustrated with this that on one instance, he ended up assaulting his teacher. His punishment for this was receiving corporal punishment in front of the entire school by the principal. On another occasion, it was said that some of the teachers encouraged another student to beat Stewart up. And when he retaliated, he was sent home. After telling Mrs. Wilken about this, she frankly didn't believe him, and she punished him by locking him up in a room. Stewart was angered by this, and he claimed that from that day on, he realized that he had no one but himself, and he would be his own mother, father, aunt, uncle. Mrs. Wilken claimed that Stewart was a really difficult child. He often acted out in violent ways, including biting people, and he bit her as well. So, one way of punishing him for this type of behavior would be her locking him in a room. And while he was locked up in this room, he would just go nuts. He would knock down all the furniture, he would scream, he would throw tantrums. He was really an angry child. Stewart claimed that his adoptive brother would physically abuse him. He also ended up wetting the bed quite frequently, and he was furthermore punished for this. At around 8 years old, Stewart started smoking marijuana, probably as a coping mechanism for everything that he had gone through up until this point. Some studies have shown that the use of marijuana at such an early age has detrimental effects to one's brain development. Stewart's now 9 years old. It's a Sunday and he goes off to church with his family, a common practice that occurs for them. And after Sunday school, a deacon at the church asked the Wilken family if they would allow him to take Stewart back to his home to spend some time with him. They agreed to this because they trusted the deacon of the church, right? But it was really unfortunate what was about to happen, as the deacon would go on to sodomize Stewart Wilken. This was incredibly devastating, and as you can imagine, for a 9-year-old boy who has already gone through so much, to now suffer this type of abuse at the hands of somebody whom he trusted, who his family trusted, it really negatively impacted on him and plays out later in a really severe way. During the same year, Stewart Wilken's adoptive father passes away. And by all accounts, they had quite a good relationship. And Mr. Wilken happened to be a really good adoptive parent to him. And they had a good relationship. Mrs. Wilken becomes very overwhelmed by everything that's happening in her life, and especially with Stewart's behavioral issues. She can't manage, she's at her wits' end, and she reaches out to the Department of Welfare. And they go ahead and tell her about this industrial reform school that's located just outside of Port Elizabeth that she could send Stewart to, that they felt would assist him in ironing out some of these issues that he was having. Stewart heads off to the reform school, and things are not about to get any better for him. In fact, he says that he suffers really bad bullying at the hands of the older boys, and including that, they end up sodomizing Stewart. He runs away from the reform school as many times as he possibly can after these incidents, but every time he would try, he would be found in town and he would be sent right back. Until one such occasion where he managed to escape. He manages to find a place to stay with his adoptive mom's sister, his adoptive aunt. She agrees to let Stewart live with her, and this was for about a month. After the month was through, she put Stewart back on a bus to his adoptive mother. Here, Stewart had to stand before a magistrate because it was a mandated order for him to attend the reform school. So he pleaded his case in front of this magistrate, and the magistrate ended up saying that if he was able to complete grade 11, there wouldn't be a need for him to continue on with the reform school. Stewart ended up passing grade 11, and he no longer had to go back to the reform school. After completing grade 11, Stewart enlists in the South African Army, and he spent about 4 months here, quite a short stint, and that was because he was discharged early for attempting to commit suicide. He heads back home to his adoptive mother, Mrs. Wilken, and not too long after finds an apprenticeship as a joiner. However, he injured his hand here and had to stop working there, but started receiving a disability grant. At 18 years old, Stewart goes off to a nightclub, and it was here he would meet his first wife, Lynn. Lynn had a daughter from a previous relationship, and together with Stewart, they had a daughter named Wane. Wane was born on the 25th of December in 1985. As you can imagine, Stewart Wilken's issues didn't just cease to exist because of this new relationship with Lynn. All his trauma culminated in a terrible relationship. There would be a lot of violence, and Lynn mentioned that Stewart would often abuse her. Things got so bad that the Department of Welfare intervened and they threatened to take away Lynn's eldest daughter. Their solution to this was that if the pair were to get married, they would not take the child away because their belief was that the reason for all of this instability was the fact that they were not married. Now, I don't know why they would think that. Maybe it was the 80s, old-fashioned thinking. But obviously, things did not get better when they got married. In fact, it just got worse. So because of this, Lynn and Stewart ended up getting married to avoid the Department of Welfare taking away her daughter. Stewart claimed that Lynn turned to prostitution, that she would leave him alone with the children at night when she went off to work. This completely set him off, and he developed a real disdain for prostitutes. Lynn claimed that Stewart no longer wanted to have vaginal sex with her. He would only want anal sex and in very uncomfortable positions. In 1990, during this tumultuous relationship with Lynn, Stewart went on to commit murder against his first known victim. Montefico, just 15 years old at the time, was homeless and living on the streets. Stewart Wilken would target street children, and that was because they were an easy target for him. Not much uproar or fuss would be made once these children would disappear. Stewart took Montefico to Celia's secondary school, and it was here that he sodomized and strangled Montefico, afterward discarding his body at the school. In 1990, again, Stewart goes on to murder his second victim. He claims that after an argument with his wife Lynn, he went off to seek a prostitute. Even though he claimed he hated prostitutes, he went off to find one. And he did, at Russell Road. He met a young woman who was 25 years old named Virginia Geisman. They agreed to 50 Rand for a sexual interaction. He then drove Virginia to Dagbreek Primary School where they began having sex. Afterward, he started penetrating her anally and she started complaining. This drove Stewart completely insane and he ended up strangling Virginia. While he was strangling Virginia and she was close to death, this is when Stewart Wilken ejaculated. He left her body in the schoolyard, and the murders of Virginia Geisman and Montefico were not linked. And this is why Stewart Wilken is known to be such an unusual serial killer. Generally, serial killers have one victim profile that they target and commit their crimes against. If we have a look at Ted Bundy, for example, he specifically sought out young, attractive women to perpetrate his crimes against. Stewart Wilken had two victim profiles, and those were female prostitutes and young boys. During his fights with Lynn, she would often call the police against Stewart, and she would tell them that he was smoking marijuana, which was illegal at the time to do. They would come so frequently that they decided to put Stewart Wilken in a psychiatric hospital, namely the Elizabeth Donkin Psychiatric Hospital. He was in and out of the psychiatric hospital for months, and during his time there, he was diagnosed with psychopathy. I'm not too sure as to why they didn't keep him further or why they were not aware after his diagnosis that he would be such a dangerous member of society, but he was released. On the 10th of January in 1991, Stewart was solicited by a prostitute named Mercia Pappenfuss, and this was at the Red Lion Hotel. Mercia was 37 years old at the time. They went to St. George's Park, and Mercia demanded payment before they even started. I want to mention that there were two things that were said to drive Stewart Wilken to the point of murder, and that was number one, when a prostitute or a street child would complain about a sexual act that Stewart Wilken would want to do, especially when they complained about him having anal sex with them. Secondly, he would go into a rage if ever somebody demanded money. It's weird to me because you know what you're doing. Like, you're going to get a prostitute, you agree to money, like, okay, Stuart. But yeah, he believed that the act of sex was natural and that money shouldn't be exchanged for it. He ended up strangling and sodomizing Mersha Pappenfass and then discarded of her body. Again in 1991, but this time on the 21st of October, Stewart Wilken said that this boy agreed to have sex with him for money, and they went down to St. George's Park. The boy wanted his money, and again, Stewart Wilken became so angered. He started to strangle the boy. The boy tried to flee, but Stewart Wilken overpowered him. Now, Stewart Wilken was known to be a hefty man. He was a big guy. And the little boy couldn't get away. He was a 14-year-old teenager, you know. And Stewart Wilken ended up sodomizing and strangling this boy. And once again, upon the boy dying, Stewart Wilken ejaculated. So Stewart Wilken was highly aroused by death. This is known as the jelly bean effect. So when you're strangling somebody and you literally are watching the life go out of their body, is what arouses you to the point of ejaculation. And this is the case of Stewart. We're in 1993, where Stewart Wilken would commit his next murder. There is a bit of a gap that I would like to point out from 1991 to 1993, and I am not sure why that is, if he stopped killing altogether, or if it was maybe a case of there being murders but he didn't take accountability for these. It could also be that it was more of the visits to the psychiatric hospital, but I'm not 100% sure on this. So somewhere between June and September in 1993, Wilken met another young street child, and he took him to Target Kloof. Here at Target Kloof, Wilken strangled and sodomized the boy. Thereafter, he discarded his body in a nearby ravine. Shortly after this, Stewart Wilken was sent to the psychiatric hospital again, and when he was here, his wife Lynn applied for divorce. This went uncontested, and the two of them got a divorce. After being released yet again from the psychiatric hospital, he decides to head back home to Lynn, even though they're getting this divorce. And when Lynn sees Stewart come back home, she decides to call the police. And when he realizes this, he, out of, I'm sure, just desperation, or whatever it may be, he decides to commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide, and he starts taking a whole bunch of pills. The police stop him and they send him back to the psychiatric hospital. Once his divorce with Lynn is finalized, Stewart Wilken makes a vow, and that is that he will never sleep with a white woman again. And this is because he is scared that he could meet his long-lost sister and commit incest. And for him, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. So yeah, never mind all the other things that Stewart has done up until this point. Incest is the thing that is terrible to do. And yeah, so he makes this vow, and he will only move forward and sleep with women of color. Stewart now finds a job as a fisherman on a trawler, and here he develops this love for the ocean. He enjoys his job, but Stewart is problematic, right? We know this, and he causes a lot of stress on the job. He gets into frequent fights and altercations with his co-workers, and his tantrums and short temper causes him to lose this job. So he gets fired from this job on the trawler. Stewart is now dating, of course he is, and he meets a colored woman named Veronica. Veronica has 2 sons from a previous relationship, and her and Stewart go on to be married and have 2 daughters of their own. Even though he is divorced from Lynn and is now in his new marriage with Veronica, Stewart still frequently goes to visit Wane, his daughter from his first marriage, and according to her half-sister, Lynn's eldest daughter, Stewart makes a lot of effort for Wane. He visits, he brings presents, they have a really good relationship, and it seems that he really loves her. His marriage with Lynn, things don't get better, obviously. There is still violence, there is still drama, and his murder spree continues. On the 27th of July in 1995, Stewart meets another prostitute. Her name is Georgina Boniswe Zwene. She's 42 years old. He agrees to pay Georgina 30 Rand for a sexual interaction, and thereafter he takes her to Prince Alfred's Park. At the park, he goes on to sodomize and strangle Georgina. Once completed with this, he said that he was still consumed with so much of a lust and he needed more. So after everything that he had just done to Georgina, he goes on further to start wild stabbing her. And he takes a knife and he puts it into her vagina and basically just ravages Georgina's body. Once he is done with this, he then said to cut off Georgina's nipples and consume them. Not only is Stewart Wilken a serial killer, a sadist, he is also a cannibal. He just ate Georgina's nipples. When he is done consuming some of Georgina's flesh, he discards her clothes in a nearby fish pond. Things get even stranger on the 10th of September in 1995 when Stewart goes to visit his daughter Wane at her home. Now, shortly after Lynn and Stewart had gotten divorced, Lynn went on to remarry. And Lynn's new husband and Stewart could not stand each other. They often got into physical altercations with one another, and because of this, whenever Stewart would go and visit Wane, they would end up having to sit outside of the home, often on the street or like on the pavement nearby, just to like stop any like violent stuff that could go on between him and her new stepdad. On this day in September, after visiting with Wane, she is never seen again. And it was actually her elder sister who had last seen her and Stewart Wilken together. Stewart Wilken alleges that Wane confided in him and told him that her stepfather was sexually molesting her. There was often no food in the house and that she wanted to run away. Stewart Wilken, identifying with this type of traumatic childhood, decided that he wanted to give Wane an out. And that out was sending her to God. Wilken decides that before he will send Wane to God, he would start off by taking her to a place called Happy Valley. Happy Valley has significance to Stewart Wilken because when he was a young child, his family would take him there. And this was one of the places that he said he felt peace and joy. And at Happy Valley, there would be these little statues of dwarves and fairies, and it just provided him with a safe refuge. And he wanted to give this to Wane. So he ended up taking her to Happy Valley. Once at Happy Valley, he decides that he would give her a exam to determine whether or not she was still a virgin, to check whether her claims of being sexually molested by her stepfather was true. He then began to inspect Wane's vagina and realized that she was no longer a virgin and started strangling Wane. When Wane had died, Stewart did not discard of her body. In fact, he kept her remains for a long period of time, often sleeping next to them every night and talking to her body. When the body became so severely decomposed that he could no longer do this, he took her skeletal remains and discarded of them at a nearby Garden Court Holiday Inn. And he would keep Wane's clothing that she was wearing at the time, and he stuffed them up to make it resemble her being alive, and he would continue sleeping next to her clothes or this resemblance of her and talk to it at night. On the 25th of May in 1996, Stewart met Katrina Claassen, a 22-year-old prostitute. They met at the Albany Road interchange and afterward walked down to the beach together. Out of fear of Katrina screaming, Stewart stuffed a piece of plastic down her throat. After doing this, he sodomized and strangled Katrina Claassen. Between May and August of 1996, Stewart met another young homeless child and took him to Fort Frederick. After the boy had masturbated Stewart Wilken, he then began to undress the boy and sodomized him. After this, the boy threatened to tell the police. Stewart Wilken became enraged and then strangled the boy. He went on to dump this boy's body at Saliers Secondary School, the place he committed his first known murder. I found this really random piece of information that I wanted to share with you. It was said that Stewart Wilken and Veronica and their family went and lived with Lynn, her children, and a new husband for a time. I'm not too sure why, if it maybe had to do with financial issues or whatever the case may be, but they ended up living together for a short period of time. And I found this really crazy because, I mean, Lynn's new husband hated Stewart. They often fought. I'm really not sure like why, but it's just so crazy, right? Like, why would they do that? But yeah, they did that. Stewart's in-laws, Veronica's parents, hated Stewart. They despised Stewart, and one of the main reasons for this was because Veronica's sons went to them and claimed that Stewart was sodomizing them. They became completely enraged, obviously, at this, and they decided to tell the police about this. So an investigation ensued for 2 counts of sodomy against Stewart Wilken. Because of this, Stewart Wilken decided to move out, and he went to live near the bushes around Happy Valley. This brings us to the 22nd of January 1997. Stewart Wilken is about to commit his last murder, and this would be the murder that led to his arrest. Stewart Wilken knew a 12-year-old boy named Henry Bakers, and this is because Stewart had a relationship with the boy's mother named Ellen Bakers, and during some difficult times in his marriage, he would go and stay with Ellen Bakers. Henry Bakers is with his grandmother in Missionville. He's about to head home to his mom's house in Algoa Park, but before doing so, decides to play in the park with one of his friends. His friend then tells Henry that he needs to go and buy some milk and bread for his family. When the boy's done at the shop, he heads back home and he notices Henry talking to a man that the little boy knew as Boetie Boer, because this was Stewart Wilken's name in the community. He sees them on a road called Dyke Way, and he approaches them and he asks Henry, where are they going? To which Stewart Wilken responded quite aggressively that it is none of your business. After a day of Henry Baker not returning home, his mom Ellen was not too concerned because she knew he often stayed with his grandmother. However, on the second day of Henry still not returning home, she decided to head out to Henry's grandmother and figure out what was happening. It was here that she learned the disturbing news that Henry had made his way back home to her on the Wednesday. Distressed by this information, she heads off to the police station where she reports Henry as missing. According to reports, Wilken saw Henry Bakers making his way to Algoa Park, where he stopped him and said he would give him a lift. According to Wilken, the boy wanted to know about sex and wanted to find out if Stewart Wilken would be able to tell him more or teach him. And Wilken agreed to this, and he took him to a nearby field on the outskirts of Algoa Park. Here he told the boy to remove his clothes and perform fellatio on him. When he was done with this, he then proceeded to lay Henry Baker's down and sodomize him. Henry Baker started crying and protesting, and because of this, Stewart Wilken said he strangled him. Wilken claimed that he also wanted to spare Henry's life, that Henry was suffering abuse at the hands of his parents, and he wanted to send Henry to God the same way he had done with Wane. However, Henry's parents say that they did scold Henry if he was naughty, but they never performed the type of physical abuse that Wilken claimed. Adding fuel to this already horrific fire, Stewart Wilken claims that he performed necrophilia on his male victims. He said that he would take newspaper, roll it up, and then insert it into their anuses so that when decomposition would take place, it wouldn't interfere with him going back and performing sexual intercourse on their corpses. I mean, as killers go, this is pretty much like, how much worse could things get? Serial killer, cannibal, necrophiliac. I mean, after Henry Baker's mom had reported him missing, the Child Protection Unit appointed Sergeant Ursula Barnard. She called Stewart Wilken in for questioning, and he was so eager to help the sergeant. He seemed genuinely concerned for the well-being of Henry. He claimed that he had seen Henry, but that he had said goodbye to him and they went their separate ways. He said that he stayed over at a lady friend's house that day. Because he provided an alibi and there was no further evidence to hold him, Stewart Wilken was released. While Sergeant Ursula Barnard checked out Stewart Wilken's alibi, she also did some further digging, and it was here that she discovered that he had the two charges of sodomy that were being investigated against him, but also that he was the last known person to be seen with his daughter Wane. Because of all of this information and the alibi turning out to be false, she contacted Sergeant Derek Nosworthy. Derek Nosworthy was trained by South Africa's first serial killer profiler, Dr. Mickey Pistorius, and they felt that he would be the best person to assist with this case. Sergeant Nosworthy called Stewart Wilken in for questioning once again. Sergeant Nosworthy strategically had a photo of his own daughter, who was the same age as Wane, on the table in the room. He noticed how transfixed Stewart Wilken was on this photo of his daughter, and that when he left the room and returned, Stewart Wilken was still staring at this photograph. Now, he alerted Stewart Wilken to the fact that he was trained in serial killers. He was an expert because he wanted him to know that he couldn't wiggle his way out of this one. This was somebody who knew his stuff. He went on to tell Stewart Wilken that he believed he had killed both Henry Baker's and his daughter Wane. Stewart Wilken, seemingly shook, reached his hands across the table and said the words, "I am sick." He then went on to confess to the murders of his daughter Wane and also Henry Baker's. He also said that just that morning, he went to perform necrophilia on Henry Baker's body. He then escorted the police to the remains of the two bodies. He started with Wane at the Garden Court Holiday Inn, where he showed police where he had discarded of her skeletal remains. He then took the police to the bushes in Algoa Park, where he had discarded of Henry Baker's body. And at this stage, the body was so severely decomposed. Back at the police station, Sergeant Nosworthy informed Stewart Wilken that he believed that there weren't just these two victims and that there had to be more. Eventually, Stewart Wilken started confessing and ultimately spoke about his 10 victims. He then went on to write a detailed confession with the assistance of his lawyer. Initially, Stewart Wilken was charged with the murder of Wanay and Henry Baker, but subsequent to his confession and other investigations done by Sergeant Norsworthy and his team, this was bumped up to 10 charges. During the trial, Stewart was interviewed by Dr. Mickey Pistorius, who I mentioned previously, and in addition to that, Professor Tuvia Zabau, who had to distinguish whether or not Stewart had the capacity to stand trial and if he understood right from wrong. During some of the interviews between Dr. Mickey Pistorius and Stewart Wilken, she said that when he would speak about the sexual nature of his crimes, he needed to be excused because he had the urge to masturbate. And she said that she experienced this only once before with Moses Sithole. She also said that Stewart claimed that there was no sexual element to the death of Wanay. That was before or after her death. However, Dr. Mickey Pistorius felt that this was not true. Which brings me to this. During his trial, Justice Chris Jansen said that Stewart Wilken showed no remorse, no emotion, except for 2 instances. And the first being was when Wanay's skeletal remains were shown, her skull. At this point, Stewart Wilken asked for an adjournment, and he said that he needed to use the restroom. The reason for this was because he needed to masturbate. So this was also why Dr. Mickey Pistorius felt that there had to be some sort of sexual component to Wanay's death. Yeah. So he paused the trial because he needed to masturbate after seeing his daughter's skull. The second occasion where he showed emotion was when his sentence was read out. Stewart Wilken was given 7 life sentences. And at this point, he burst into tears. Even though he was charged with the murders of 10 people, there was only sufficient evidence to prove the 7. Stewart Wilken asked the court for a lengthy prison sentence, preferably at a psychiatric institution where he could receive the treatment that he said he needed so that if he were ever to be released, he could live as a normal person in society. Stewart Wilken is serving out his prison sentence currently at St. Albans Correctional Facility. Stewart Wilken says here that he is tormented by the ghosts of his victims and that he has no peace. Now remember Stewart's second wife Veronica, well, she attended the trial, and after his sentence was read out, it was said that the two of them spent a few minutes chatting, and when they were done, embraced and ended in a passionate kiss. Like, I don't know about you, but passionately kissing the man that was said to have sodomized and molested my sons, and then also committed all of that. Okay, Veronica. Okay. In a strange twist of events, Stewart Wilken's first wife, Lynn, she was on her way to a telephone booth to call her third husband. And as she was approaching this telephone booth, a few men abducted her, and her child that she was with at the time managed to escape, but her body was found the next day bludgeoned to death and also severely mutilated. I'm not sure if there is a link somehow to her murder and what happened with Stewart Wilken, but I mean, it's a really terrible thing. And her third husband claimed that they were in the process of moving in together into a new home together, and that Lynn was finally making some strides in, her emotional recovery from what she had undergone with Stewart Wilken. Another interesting piece of information about this is that Sergeant Norsworthy managed to track down Stewart Wilken's biological mother. She asked Another interesting piece of information about this is that Sergeant Derek Norsworthy was able to track down Stewart Wilken's biological mother, and they had a conversation. She asked him to let Stewart Wilken know that she was not the one to abandon him. In fact, it was his father who made her do so because she was pregnant yet again and they couldn't look after another child. Sergeant Norsworthy set up a telephone call between Stewart Wilken and his mom, and he listened into this call. He says that Stewart reverted back to a child. He burst into tears. He used the word mommy, and he said that this was the very first time he recalled him saying the word mommy. Apparently, his mom said that she had gone back for Stewart Wilken's sister. She got her back. And for me, that's a bit bittersweet. In one way, I'm glad that Stewart Wilken's sister was safe, that Duke did not murder her. But in another way, I'm sad that, like, why didn't she take Stewart Wilken back, as well, and spared him all of this devastation that he went through. But yeah, that was his interaction with his mom. And that brings us to the end of this video. I would like to thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about Stewart Wilken. I, for one, have a lot of empathy for his childhood and what he went through. I mean, he had it rough. Abandonment, child abuse, torture, neglect, and it was all left untreated. The more I'm doing research into serial killers, I'm learning that their childhood often holds the key to what created these dangerous members of society later on. I also want to send my respects to all of the victims and the families of the victims of Stewart Wilken. That is it from me. Thank you for watching. Take care, and I will see you for the next video. Bye.